Ukraine, meaning borderlands or frontier, is one of the most historically significant and fought-over lands in the world, with its beginnings as a great Christian empire eventually giving way to its position as a borderland in the middle of a tug-of-war over valuable rivers, forests, and steppes. The peoples of Ukraine have historically been known as Rus, oftentimes Latinized to Ruthenes or Ruthenians. These were the Eastern Slavic people that had come under the control of the originally Scandinavian Rus princes, with the polity later forming an Orthodox Christian Byzantium of the North, based in Kiev. However, after years of turmoil and division, including the Mongol and other foreign interventions, the realms of the former Rus state were well and truly divided. As the Mongol yoke waned on the Eastern Slavic population, Moscow emerged as a renewed center of Rus dominance and influence, while Kiev and other Western Rus cities became fought over by factions including Moscow itself. While the Muscovites would become known as Russians or Great Rus, the Kievans and the rest of the Eastern Slavs remained known as simply Rus or Ruthenes, with the Kievan Ruthenians eventually becoming known as Ukrainians, again referencing the Slavic word for borderlands or frontier. However, that process came to be over the course of many centuries and much history, a lot of which involved outside players and which helped shape the modern-day Ukrainian identity. One of the main storylines throughout Ukrainian history, especially between the 16th and 20th centuries, is that of the Cossacks, a fiercely independent people commonly associated with the Russian Empire and the modern-day Russian Federation, but who have always been quite ambiguous about identifying with one government or another, or indeed identifying with one nation or another, as the Cossacks essentially form their own unique national group. Although numerous wars and other conflicts were occurring at the times that we're going to be talking about, you'll see some of the other events on the periphery, but we'll mainly be focusing on the Cossacks and their role in the many conflicts in this area during this time. In the centuries leading up to the mid-1600s, the westernmost area of the Eurasian steppe lands saw the collapse of the Great Mongol Empire and later the Golden Horde, resulting in the area becoming known as the Wild Fields, with the remaining Tatars in Crimea expanding slowly to the north, while Polish settlement moved slowly to the south and east. A majority of the Wild Fields would be settled by Christian frontiersmen, not just Rus, but Polish peasants, Circassians, Caucasians, and members of other nearby ethnic groups. However, as the Cossacks developed into frontier warriors on the borders of Christendom, the areas of the Cossack host, known as Zaporozhia, became largely subordinated to Ruthenian Orthodox culture. However, the 1569 Union of Lublin had granted these lands, which had previously been part of the Lithuanian side of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, to the Catholic Polish side. Later, in 1596, the Ruthenian Orthodox Church had split from the Moscow Orthodox Church and had instead realigned itself with the Pope in Rome, essentially turning the Ruthenian Church into a quasi-Catholic entity. By the mid-1600s, internal squabbles within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which had struggled for years with Cossack rebellions and revolts, now spiraled into a full-on Cossack uprising and a Polish-Ruthenian war, known as the Khmelnytsky Uprising. It was led by Bohdan Khmelnytsky, an Orthodox Cossack nobleman who is experiencing trouble from Polish officials, up to and including raids and confiscation of his land. The Zaporozhian Cossacks were already on the edge of rebellion, as again the situation had been simmering for years, and in the early part of 1648, Khmelnytsky would form an alliance with the Crimean Tatars and launch a war against Poland on behalf of the Ruthenians and the Cossacks. This was an important turning point for other reasons as well, as the Cossacks and Crimean Tatars had traditionally raided each other's lands, of course considering one another to be religious infidels, but now the two longtime foes of the steppes were working together. Meanwhile, Catholics and Jews fled the Orthodox Muslim alliance, and many were killed for their perceived role collaborating with the Polish government. By mid-August 1649, the Cossacks had captured Chernigov and had laid siege to Kiev. As battles began to rage toward the west in Galicia, the Polish king John II Casimir was forced to make peace with the Crimean Tatars. This, however, weakened the position of Khmelnytsky, and he would agree to peace in the Treaty of Zborov. This essentially granted independence to the Zaporozhian Cossacks, and Khmelnytsky would proclaim himself sole autocrat of Ruthenia. Lithuania, an homage to the Russian imperial title, which itself paid homage to the Roman imperial title. However, the war would recommence 2 years later with much action involving the north. In September 1651, a treaty was signed after a major Cossack defeat. This would have essentially made Zaporozhia back into a Polish vassal, but the treaty was never ratified by the Polish nobility. The Cossacks had given up Chernihiv, however they would recapture it in mid-1652. The war grew bloodier, with this campaign including the mass slaughter of Polish nobility and officials, along with Catholic priests and Jewish businessmen, both of whom were seen as symbols of Polish overlordship and of the Polonization and Catholicization campaigns conducted against the Orthodox Ukrainians. Wars would continue over the next 2 years, both with the Orthodox Ottoman vassals to the southwest and with the Catholic Poles to the northwest. Several times since the start of the war, there had been informal discussions and negotiations regarding the potential subordination of the Cossack host to Russia and the possible reunity of the Ruthenian Orthodox Church to Moscow. This was not a universally popular position even among the Cossacks, and many saw Moscow as one of the main threats. On January 18th of 1654, a council at Pereyaslav between representatives of the Zaporozhian Cossacks and the Russian Tsar Alexei I met to demonstrate the, quote, determination and unity of the Rus nation. Khmelnytsky then arrived to personally speak at the event. This caused the outbreak of war between Russia and Poland. In a bit of a rematch of the Smolensk War 20 years earlier, the Russians invaded Poland from the northeast and captured Smolensk on September 27th. The Cossacks would assist by launching their own offensives in the south. Meanwhile, in 1655, Russia would capture Minsk and Vilnius. This then prompted the Swedes to get involved. Some Polish nobles, fearful of the loss of territory and losing faith in Jan Casimir, had asked the Swedish king Charles Gustav to become the king of Poland, potentially using the massive Swedish army to recapture the lost territories in the east. However, this would prove to be a disaster and would instead initiate the onset of the Deluge, the term used for the time when Poland was split up between Sweden, Russia, the Cossacks, and others. In light of this new situation, Poland and Russia would reconcile and declare war together on Sweden. By 1657, the Crimean Tatars were no longer in league with the Cossacks, while Khmelnytsky was having second thoughts about his subordination to the Russians, instead entering negotiations with the Swedish. However, on August 6th, Khmelnytsky passed away. He had named his son Yuri the hetman of the Cossacks. Yuri, however, was only in his early 20s and was not a strong leader, thus giving way to civil strife in Zaporozhia. This became known as the Ukrainian Ruin, where for much of the next 25 years, the Ruthenians and Cossacks would see their loyalties split between different internal factions, many of whom were sponsored by foreign powers. However, the Cossack host was still mostly united on the 16th of September 1658, when the Treaty of Hadiach was signed, changing the suzerainty over the Cossack hetmanate to that of Poland-Lithuania, with a plan in place to incorporate Ruthenia as its own element of the Commonwealth. The plan being to name the leading Ruthenian Cossack hetman as the Grand Duke of Rus, with Rus or Ruthenia set to join Poland and Lithuania as an equal constituent member of the Commonwealth. However, this aspect was never finalized, and the Russians subsequently invaded Zaporozhia. The majority of Ukraine was back under Russian control. The Russians then had the Cossacks sign the Pereyaslav Articles, which reinstated the former Pereyaslav Treaty, placing the Cossack host under Russian suzerainty. However, it was more restricted this time, and the autonomy given to the Cossacks was far more limited. This would not last for long, though, as Poland subsequently invaded the right bank of the Dnieper River, that is western Ukraine, and some of the disgruntled Cossacks would end up signing an agreement with the Polish. This was the Treaty of Chudnov, and it granted most of right bank Ukraine, with the exception of Kiev, to the Polish. This time there was no lip service paid to an equal status within the Commonwealth for Ruthenia. It would not take long for the hetman of Polish Ruthenia, Petro Doroshenko, to turn on the Poles himself, form an alliance with the Ottomans and the Crimean Tatars, and invade the Russian left bank of Ukraine. Early the next year, a peace treaty was signed between the Russians and the Polish. This granted to Russia the left bank of the Dnieper and Smolensk in perpetuity, and also allowed a 2-year lease over Kiev, which would be subsequently permanently purchased by the Russians. This Treaty of Andrusovo would clear up for the time being the disagreements between the Polish and the Russians over Ukraine, and effectively divided up the Ruthenian lands between Russia and Poland. However, the Ottoman-affiliated Doroshenko still held a large amount of control on the ground. In June of the next year, 1668, he had proclaimed himself the hetman of all Ruthenia, following his uniting of the left and right bank, effectively making the entire Cossack host into an Ottoman vassal. However, the Poles, under their terms of the Treaty of Andrusovo, subsequently invaded the right bank to recapture their designated territory, while Doroshenko's personally appointed hetman of the left bank saw his administration become increasingly vulnerable to Russian influence, eventually being forced to recognize Russian suzerainty as granted under the terms of the Treaty of Andrusovo. This essentially secured Kiev and the left bank of Ukraine for the Russian Tsardom. Although the right bank would continue to be contested between the proxies of the Ottomans and the Polish for decades afterward, this solidified Russia as the protector of Kiev and the majority of the Ruthenian Cossacks, and eventually both banks of the Dnieper would be incorporated into the Russian Tsardom. Meanwhile, the chaos would spread the Cossacks out into different hosts, again some affiliated with the Ottomans and the Polish, at least in the immediate future, but most of the disparate Cossack groups continued to be affiliated with the Russian Empire for centuries to come, adding new Russian Cossack hosts in the Don, the Kuban, and the Caucasus. The Cossacks would go on to play an integral role in the history of the Russian Empire, especially in its frontier expansions, with the Cossacks essentially playing a pioneer role, not only just in the Kuban and the Caucasus, but eventually expanding into the Urals, Central Asia, Siberia, and beyond. Although next week we'll be exploring the war in Ukraine since 2014, many of these Cossack adventures would be interesting to cover and potentially do a video on in the future. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Donate on Patreon if you can, and check us out at apoliticalworldmap.org. Thanks again for watching. I'm Alex. I am out.